Hello, everybody. Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Talismania. I am here with the Mighty Blue Orthodox, and we are about to play some more Talisman and talk about video games and video game related stuff. Are you excited?
Get hyped. Get hyped. Get hyped.
Getting on the hype train. Let's do this thing. So, as is our custom, well, I guess we can have customs, right? Since this is our second episode, we're allowed to have that. We are going to set up our game and then talk a little about recent developments in the world of Talisman. And then we are going to get into some general gaming type news. So, if you're not super hyped for Talisman, but you still like gaming stuff, give us a minute to get started and we will accommodate you.
Yeah, yeah. Right, right.
Nice. So I think those settings that we used last time worked out pretty well. So I'm probably going to go with something similar again this time. So like Reaper on, Frost March on, random characters on, um, character selection on, revealed endings, and no original ending. And we'll stick with our 60-second timeouts in case there are issues.
Issues.
All right. You ready to kick this puppy?
Hey, man, that's not cool.
Yeah, stop the violence and stuff. I know that was probably poor choice of words on my part. All right, let's see what I draw. Oh, awesome. I've been wanting to do this ending for a while now. Have you seen this before? The Dance Macabre?
I don't believe I have.
So this is pretty crazy. In this variant, the Grim Reaper is more powerful because you subtract one from whatever you roll. So basically, a 2 or a 1 is a 1, and you can't get a 6 because even if you roll a 6, it's really a 5. And when somebody gets to the crown at the end of the game, they control the Reaper from the crown to kill off their enemies.
Nice.
Oh man, look at this. Look at these choices. How do I not take the assassin? That would just be dumb if I didn't take the assassin, wouldn't it?
Go ahead, take 'em.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, I gotta go with my sage in this case.
Nice, good choice. Ooh, AI rocking the lock. Pretty cool. And the warrior, little old school and new school. Uh-oh. Something bad's happening right out the gate. Seriously?
As Will Smith once said, I ain't even mad.
Oh, well, you know, if you're gonna have that happen, that's a pretty good time to have it happen when it doesn't matter.
He was trying to be all slick on me there.
I think it would have been really funny had you rolled a 6. I would have been very amused by that. So unfortunately, my craft is not high enough to actually benefit from that, but somebody who has 4 or more will probably want to rush to that square. Hint, hint.
Oh, I know, I'm on my way.
Nice. So, as promised, let's talk a little bit about the upcoming Talisman expansion, the dungeon expansion, which we kind of touched on a little bit last time, but I was kind of hoping that it would be out by now so that we could actually show it. But unfortunately, came to find out that there was actually a pretty major bug found in it this past Friday, which is why it hasn't been released yet. And according to the devs, they are very close to solving that. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if that expansion were to drop like sometime within the next 3 days, like before the end of this week. But it looks like we'll be waiting for next week to actually show it here, um, which is kind of a bummer. But at the same time, it's not like the game isn't already fun in its current state.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you still got hours and hours of content, especially if you're one of those, especially if you frequent the online games a lot. So,
Hmm.
win-win either way.
Yeah, although I will say my last few online games have not gone particularly well, just in terms of people like getting frustrated and leaving, or like, trying to drop the game because things weren't going their way or whatever. I feel like there's actually been some threads about this on the forums, people talking about, you know, how do you try to tweak the game in such a way to discourage people from that sort of behavior, um, because it's kind of a bummer, when you get 3/4 of the way through a game and then all of a sudden the people you're playing with drop and you end up playing with AIs, or worse yet, can't continue the game because of some network problem. Um, so I kind of feel like, there's probably some room for improvement there, although I'm not entirely sure what the best answer is to that issue.
Yeah. I mean, I would definitely agree. I just think that if somebody gets frustrated and leaves, that's fine with me. But the problem is that you know again, like you just said, most of the time when somebody does drop out, there's a network problem, and so it usually just freezes on that character's turn, and it never resolves itself.
Hmm. Yeah, I'd really like to see those network connectivity and synchronization issues resolved more. I mean, I feel like there's definitely been progress made, especially in this most recent patch, in terms of network stability and in terms of being able to resume games that have been interrupted midstream, like especially, if everybody's willing to get back into the lobby and reinitialize, that seems to work pretty well. But it would be nice if those issues just didn't occur in the first place. And I know, listening to the devs talk about it and reading the forums and stuff, it's clear that their intent is to fix all that stuff. But I just imagine with a game with as many complex and intertwined rules as this game has, it's probably at least a little bit difficult to account for every possible scenario that can occur.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and that's again just with how Talisman is, where most of it is based on luck and probabilities more so than skill or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely an element of skill to aspects of the game, but you are also a lot of times at the mercy of your dice rolls when it comes to a lot of different things that happen in the game. Like, you can definitely minimize your risk to a certain extent, and really, give yourself a better odds of success, but there's still things that can happen regardless of what you do that you just can't necessarily account for.
Thus is the way of Talisman.
Indeed. Nice pickup.
Thank you.
All right, so with that out of the way, let's talk about some other games. And let's start with something new, and then we'll go on to something old a bit later. But let's talk a little bit about The Evil Within, which was just released yesterday, across the new consoles and PC. And were you a fan of, or did you play a lot of Resident Evil 4 back in the day, or is that a game that you missed?
Um, no, I mean I had a chance to play it. Um, actually got a chance to play it over a cousin's house of mine. So I was able to see what all the really all the buzz about the game was.
Hmm. So what were your like general thoughts on Resident Evil 4 like as a game? Like did you were you in the like this is the best game ever crowd, or were you like this is a good game, or were you like this is kind of overrated?
I mean, for me, certain aspects of the game I liked right off the bat. The merchant, the fact that you can just save up a ton of things to go and then buy from the creepy guy, whether it was weapons or ammo. I liked that. But me in that game though, I mean, it's just for me the camera always kind of gave me a headache, and that's just a personal thing, because I've played other third person games where I haven't really had that same issue, but for some reason with Resident Evil 4, that really it seemed to really just give me a headache every time I sat down and played it for a good long while. And I think it was because, more so the camera than anything else.
Hmm. So I'll tell you my thoughts on Resident Evil 4. Basically boil down to this. I think like design wise and structurally, I really admire that game because there's some really cool ideas in it and some really cool like character design and level design and environmental design. But the big problem and the thing that I just couldn't get over with it, and why I never actually ended up finishing the game is the controls. The whole tank controls, having to stop and plant your feet to fire, like all of that stuff, just was a complete turn off to me. And I understand, there's something to be said for the tension that's associated with that style of gameplay, where you're like, having to commit to your position and then fire. But in a world where first person shooters are so prevalent and even third person shooters were so prevalent, and mechanics had already kind of embraced the idea of moving and shooting, there was something about that game that even when it was brand new kind of felt antiquated to me, and I found very just generally off-putting. And I tried playing it again on the Wii because I wondered if the Wii controls would help or hinder that in any way. Um, and what I ended up finding was while the game felt like more immediate and interesting to a certain extent, it also didn't really capture me uh, in enough of a way to make me complete the game. Like I definitely got further than I did playing it on the GameCube originally, but I still wasn't able to make it all the way through the game. And I only bring up all of this stuff because obviously with the Evil Within being created by the guy who made Resident Evil 4 essentially, or at least was the main designer behind that game, um, you can see a lot of Resident Evil 4, firmly implanted in the Evil Within, like both aesthetically, mechanically, and just general design philosophy. I think are all like pretty significantly represented there, and significantly similar between those two games.
I would agree with that. But, however, I will also say that it seems like in doing so, um, it really kind of inherited some of again, the problems that Resident Evil 4 had
Hmm.
with the tank controls and the clunky camera, and which again I still think is just a me thing, uh, but maybe thinking back to it now, but maybe it was just the combination of the tank controls and the camera that was the thing that kind of turned me off. Because when you're trying to fight a giant horde of things and you're not on like your second playthrough and you're just like going, rolling with mad gear or whatever,
Hmm.
and you're kind of in that really awkward position of trying to fight hordes with just the stuff that you've been able to scrape together. It I think it just makes it more difficult than it actually should be. Almost like the artificial lengthening of gameplay and all that.
Sure. And I would say I definitely feel like there's something to that, um, based on my experience with those kind of mechanics. I mean, obviously, it's been a while since I've played a game done in that style, done in that mechanical style. But by the same token, I feel like uh, there's something about the cumbersome nature of those controls and that camera style, and that kind of leads into the whole issue I think with Evil Within from what I've seen of it, which is the letterboxing of the camera. Like especially on the PC version, I find that really unacceptable, and like I have a hard time believing the justification of it being a conscious art style decision on their part because it's pretty obvious looking at that game and how it performs on consoles that the letterboxing is just there to try to increase the frame rate on the console versions of the game, and the fact that there are hacks where you can take the letterboxing off the PC version and it still runs perfectly fine at 60 FPS on a machine that can handle it. It says to me that that's something they very easily could have made into an in-game toggle, at least on the PC version. Um, and it would have been cool to keep the letterboxing for lower end machines so they could still play the game, but it just bugs me. Like that's one of those kind of lazy console port things that always bugs me. Like when you make a decision for the platform that you're initially targeting, but then don't bother to rethink that decision for the other platforms you're releasing on. I find that always to be a bit frustrating. And I've heard other things about that game too on the PC, talking to some other streamers about it. The fact that the PC controls feel kind of clunky and not very good. Like basically you have to be playing with a controller even on PC for the actual movement mechanics and stuff to feel the way they probably were intended to. I think stuff like that's a bit disconcerting, especially for a game that's being priced the way that it is.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, absolutely. $50 game, and again, if it's a shoddy port, then
Yeah,
it it shouldn't be there, or it should be. Again, something's got to happen. Patching down the line, or immediate action has to take place in order for that game to be playable
yeah,
for the PC, again, from the PC spectrum.
right, right. Like I'm sure, like it basically is what it is on the consoles, right? Like they've done whatever they could to make it run as well as they can, on that hardware. And you could maybe argue that they're not optimized as much as they could or should be, or maybe like there's other id Tech games that are running better, on that same hardware. Um, and maybe there's some room for improvement there too. But I feel like there's some really basic fundamental things like the ability to remove the letterboxing and having better mouse and keyboard control support that just really should have been the case out of the gate. And like, you really shouldn't have to be waiting as a PC user for those features to be patched in. Like that's kind of a major faux pas on their part to not have them in there right out the gate. I'd almost prefer a game like that be delayed a month or two on PC and come out in the condition that it should be in than, to rush it out to be out day and date if it's not going to really embrace the platform.
Well, yeah, yeah. And you look at two games, that took a while, or at least, well, one game that took a while that is now coming to PC for a fact is, Grand Theft Auto 5. That
Hmm.
took a long time to actually, get the green light to come to PC because Rockstar wanted to make absolutely sure that it wasn't, a half-assed port. Well, and I can't even say if it is or isn't because it's not out yet, but knowing Rockstar, that's most likely the reason why they took, so much time to actually, port a good version of it, with all the things that PC gamers come to expect from, a massive gaming rig.
Well, and I think too, when you look at the historical precedent of GTA 4 and how poor and poorly received the PC port of that game was, I think they, at the very least, understand that people aren't going to accept that same level of, polish in anything they do moving forward. I feel like it's a once bitten, twice shy situation with them, right? Where like because GTA 4 didn't do so hot on the PC, at least in its initial release, um, that is made a lot of people a little gun shy and caused them to take more of a wait and see approach with GTA 5. Like I'm sure there are a lot of people who rushed out and bought GTA 4 on PC only to be disappointed by it and now are um, looking at it in terms of what's the deal actually going to be? Is this going to perform properly? Is it going to um, is it going to live up to expectations? I don't think a lot of people are going to be willing to just buy the thing without seeing some reviews or some footage or something like that.
Yeah,
But they've still got a while before release, at least as far as I understand. So I don't doubt that they will get everything in good order and, put out a decent version of it. But just looking at it from the historical perspective, they definitely have something to prove to the PC audience, I feel like.
I think a lot of people have a lot to to prove, especially from a AAA standpoint to the PC gamers,
Hmm.
such as
Such as, where are you going with
Segway,
that?
Ubisoft.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's, yeah, geez, oh whiz, what a train wreck there. So where to even begin? So I guess we can call this our conspiracy theory of the week segment, because I've been doing a little research on this whole Assassin's Creed Unity at 900p on consoles news that kind of broke last week. And interestingly enough, the piece that makes that whole puzzle make sense was just announced today, which is the fact that there's going to be an Xbox One bundle of Assassin's Creed Unity, which is also going to include Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. And the interesting thing about that is that Ubisoft just came out last week and said the console versions, both the Xbox One and PS4 versions of Assassin's Creed Unity, will be 900p instead of 1080p and will be locked at 30 frames a second. And there's been a lot of debate and a lot of talk as to whether or not, like, why that's actually the case. And Ubisoft has kind of advanced the theory that, or the argument that it's a CPU issue and that, the graphics could actually perform faster, but because they're using so much CPU in these machines for AI, that there's just not enough um, room or sort of bandwidth left over to render scenes at more than 30 frames a second because of all the AI calculations that are being bottlenecked by the CPU. And I can believe that there's some truth to that. I can see where that becomes a sort of quasi logical argument. But the thing that I find very telling about that whole situation is the fact that this arrangement with Microsoft has just been announced. Because I would be willing to bet, and if I were a betting conspiracy theory type man, I would say that what's happened in reality is the PS4, with its faster memory architecture, probably was capable of doing that game at 1080p. but because they knew they were cutting this deal with Microsoft to bundle it and the previous game on the Xbox One, they didn't want the PS4 version outperforming the version they were going to bundle with this console. So they are, in theory, hamstringing the PS4 version down to 900p so that it doesn't, stand different from the Xbox One version that they're obviously benefiting from this bundle deal on. Now, of course, all of that's theoretical, right? That's there's some evidence that might indicate that that's the case, but there's nothing definitive that says that that's actually what's going on. That's just sort of putting the pieces together based on these various announcements that have happened over the past couple of weeks. But what's not a theory is the fact that the PC version of that game is going to ship day and date with the console version. And I think what you're going to see is a tremendous uproar from the PC community if that game doesn't hit at least 60 frames a second on PC, because that, or doesn't at least have the ability to do that based on the level of your hardware configuration. Because if their excuse for why it's 30 frames a second and 900p on consoles is a CPU issue, a lot of gaming PCs have way better CPUs than are in either of those consoles. So that can't be the rationale for locking that frame rate or locking a resolution on the PC version. So this is another one of those cases where if the PC version of that game comes out and it doesn't have the potential to fully benefit from the hardware that's in the average gaming rig these days, I think you're going to see a lot of really upset people.
And I think it would be justified, especially in this case, where, if our conspiracy theory comes true, then, Ubisoft should be held accountable for making a business move or business decision rather than just, a decision for gamer. Just to
Yeah,
get the most, just to get the money from Microsoft.
yeah. I mean, it wouldn't be anything new or earth-shattering for a game publisher to um, uh, geez, I am Mr. Talisman slash Warlock Quest. This game apparently.
Super crazy.
But it certainly wouldn't be the first time that the game developer or publisher cut a deal, that wasn't in the best interest of gamers, but in their own best financial interest. So there's nothing necessarily new about that, but I think it's something where Ubisoft in particular is treading on some very thin, dangerous ground because they're already not BFFs with PC gamers as it stands.
Oh, absolutely. And again, I think with everything that we've seen from Ubisoft, from all their very, poor ports, that's putting it nicely.
Hmm.
uh, to just keep cutting deals like this. And it also comes down to too that they are a AAA developer, and you have to ask yourself, it's like, do they really need that money? I mean, because people still buy their games in droves, regardless of the quality of them. I mean,
Hmm.
you still imagine that they make a very nice profit off of the things that they do put out. Far Cry and just so many other titles. Again, Assassin's Creed, and so it's kind of weird again that they would have to that they felt that they would have to make that decision. Again, based off of, but again, and that's just me, that could just be me being, an ignorant gamer and just being like, well, Ubisoft is you know, a big name, so they must have all the money in the world. When, maybe that's not the case. Maybe they needed to cut the deal to keep the lights on. You never know at this point with AAA developers. with the way
Mm-hmm.
that the industry has been trending.
Yeah, true that. Thank you, Assassinate. Yeah, it's hard to say. Like, I love Assassin's Creed as a series. I think it's one of the best, one of the most fun, like consistently fun and interesting series of games that I've ever played. Like, even the ones that have been sort of less than great, like um, Revelations, like I still enjoyed the time that I spent with that game, even though I didn't actually finish that one. uh, I feel like that series gets a lot of unnecessary grief from a lot of people, and I think a big part of that, or a big reason for that, is because it's actually a pretty difficult game to play well. Like, there's a certain amount of skill that's required to play those games well, and a certain amount of tactical consideration that you have to employ to actually navigate through those game environments. Like, the consistent issue or gripe that I always hear leveled against Assassin's Creed is that, like, it's not fluid enough, or there's it's not easy enough to navigate the environments or whatever. But I mean, really, for my money or for my enjoyment of that game, the challenge of it is part of what appeals to me. Like, the fact that you actually have to think about what you're doing on some level, and not and not just mail it in or phone it in your gameplay. Um, there's some other games which I will not mention at the moment that have come out where people say, "Oh, this is like Assassin's Creed but better because it's so much easier to do everything." And to me, making everything easier doesn't make it better. That just makes it easier. And if it's that easy to do everything in your game, that just makes it boring to me, to a large extent. But I don't want to get too sidetracked on that. But I did want to at least mention that I feel like Ubisoft has done some good things over the past couple of years, in particular, not the least of which being the Assassin's Creed series, and things like The Crew, which I'm very excited for. That's going to be coming out here at the end of the year. Having played the betas for that on PC, I feel like that is a case where they do appear to be doing things correctly on the PC with that game. So that at least gives me some hope that they are on the right track with that stuff, and will at least produce, or have the ability to produce something good on the platform.
And I would also add that I that is one of the things that I do respect them for, is that, especially since that is a single player game, it is not easy to always make those to make single player games actually, legitimately difficult on top of enjoyable. And I feel like the challenges that they constantly give you in Assassin's Creed, just from, again, from the level design to just like the common gripe too, like you were saying, that, like, oh, the combat isn't very or at least that's the one that I always hear about the Assassin's Creed games, is like, oh, the combat isn't very difficult, you could still take on like five guys with no problem. But I think really, if you're a perfectionist at that game, you're not going to want to just rush in and have to kill five guys because you messed up and got caught.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly situations in those games that force you into group combat, and in those cases, you're going to be glad that you can parry every attack, or counter every attack. And they've gotten into some things in some of the games, and I think this is kind of telling too, where, like, sometimes gamers just trot out old arguments that aren't necessarily valid anymore, but they heard an old argument once, and then they just parrot it because they can't think for themselves. um, but a lot of those newer Assassin's Creed games, depending on the kind of enemy you're fighting, you can't necessarily parry every attack. Or, you might have to disarm an enemy and use their weapon against them, or avoid their attack and then, come at them from a different angle or whatever. Like, there's a lot of subtlety to what's going on in that game that I think is either ignored or just not given its due by a lot of people who either don't actually play the games and only read about them, or just dabble with them, and don't do uh, anything beyond that. And so I think for me, at least, when I look at Assassin's Creed, I think of it as a game that is not perfect. Like I've certainly never say those are perfect games, but I feel like those games do a lot to uh, be as broadly appealing as they possibly can be, while still having some like surprisingly specific game mechanics that are appealing in a very specific way. So I guess the thing I would say ultimately about that game is I feel like they tread a very fine line between casual gameplay and very specific, very nuanced, very intricate gameplay, and they sometimes blur that line in ways that I think confuse people, because just because you can play that game in a very simplistic way and succeed at it doesn't necessarily mean that there's not sophisticated gameplay to be had there. You just kind of have to seek it out and take advantage of it if it's something that you're interested in doing. And I don't envy them that task at all with those games in terms of having to create something that is both accessible to a wide audience, but yet still has enough meat to it to attract and retain a more hardcore, specialized audience. It's a difficult tightrope that they're walking pretty consistently with those games.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and I think they've balanced it well. I think throughout all the iterations that we've had of Assassin's Creed.
Yeah, I mean they've certainly had their share of misses and things that they've done that have been, less than great. I'm not going to suggest in any way that, like I said, that those are perfect games or they're without fault, but I think when you look at them as a whole, they take a lot more, or they're given a lot more grief by a lot of people in the gaming sort of industry slash community than they probably deserve. At least that's my kind of take on it. Like those games do a lot more right than they do wrong in the grand scheme of things, would be my argument.
And I would agree with that. And like I said, I think that the Assassin's Creed series has definitely been, there's a reason why people buy it all the time, and that's because from the very first game on, they've done a lot, again, a lot more right than they have wrong with it. And it's clear because they keep making them, right? So
Well, yeah, I mean,
if they weren't selling, or
yeah, if people didn't like them and people didn't buy them, they wouldn't keep making them. It's like Call of Duty to a certain extent, or any like popular series, right? Like there's something to it, or it wouldn't be what it is. Um, and that's just, I guess, kind of evident, right? Or probably goes without saying, but um, it is funny though, because as much as I love those games, I have not played as much of them in the past couple years as I had been, but that's just been mostly due to being really busy and not just having the time to invest in those long, kind of involved narrative-driven experiences. That hasn't been where I've been spending my time recently as a gamer, but that doesn't mean that I'm not interested in them. That just means that I'm spending my time elsewhere. Um, but anyway, I feel like we've kind of gone as far down the rabbit hole as is worth going with that stuff. Let's talk about something else.
Well, how about, speaking of a game that's like Assassin's Creed or that's been compared to it, is Lord of the Rings: Shadow of Mordor.
Sure. And actually, well, that was the game I was thinking of when I was talking about, people are kind of praising that game for being like Assassin's Creed, but in their eyes better. And when you press them for why they consider it better, they say, well, it's easier. And I'm like, well, okay. I'm not sure that I follow that logic that easier equals better, but I guess that's one way to look at it. Um, I've been looking at that game, and I automatically in my mind I go back to a game that I liked a lot from a few years back, which was War in the North. The other kind of third-person action Lord of the Rings game. Um, and of course, that game had a fully cooperative campaign for up to 3 people to play through, and that was actually one of my favorite features of that particular game. Um, and really was one of the things I enjoyed the most about it. So I was really disappointed. And I know it's a different developer and everything, but I was still kind of bummed out to see that Shadow of Mordor was a single player only game. Um, and it kind of goes under that same assessment that I just made about Assassin's Creed, where it's like it's hard for me to spend the time on a single player only game these days. It's given all the other things I could be doing with my time. If I'm going to spend time playing a game, I usually want to play with somebody else and share that experience in some way. So, like, for me anyway, single player games have to be really exceptionally amazing for me to want to spend the time with them.
Well, yeah, I mean, especially too, like most of the single player games that I frequent anymore are like the old ones, like things that people consider classics, like the old Thief games or the older Elder Scroll games, things like that, like where you know that you're getting quality gameplay out of whatever you're um, you know putting into it. Because
Hmm.
again, those games take a lot of time to actually complete. Things like Morrowind and the Thief titles. If you really want to go crazy overboard and perfectionist on them, again, it takes quite a while.
Hmm.
Same thing goes for like the Deus Ex series, but yeah, I think that I think they just missed a really good opportunity there, especially for like a game that's known for having putting out quality co-op games. Because again, War in the North was very fun, especially when me, VT, and another friend of ours actually ran through the campaign a little bit co-op, and I had a lot of fun with it. I'm like, man, if they, if Shadow of Mordor is like this, where it's the full, you still get the awesome graphics, full 3D, models, and the, with the third person to boot and all that, like that would have been an amazing experience, I think. But for just kind of going around, and it seems like, you know, for me, it just seems kind of, I don't know, repetitive. Because it seems like, oh, you go and you interrogate an orc and you figure out, or you pick a warlord to go kill. And
Hmm.
that just seems like you just have to keep on doing that until you get to the next place or you eliminate all the warlords within the given area. And I
Hmm.
just don't know, how compelling that's going to be after, so many hours that you invest in an experience like that.
Well, the having not played the game, I'm reluctant to really comment too much on it. But the one thing I will say, based on what I've seen and the discussions I have had with people who have played it, is that it seems as though there's a lot of, as you say, repetition. Like a lot of the environments feel kind of samey as you go from one place to another. A lot of the things that you do, the tasks that you do, feel kind of samey. Like the way that you actually go about dispatching enemies and dealing with scenarios and stuff like that. It seems like there's not a tremendous amount of variety there. Um, at least that's the impression that I get.
Well, yeah, and again, I mean that was just the impressions, when I was talking about it, that I was getting from just really some of the gameplay and walkthroughs that I've been watching recently is sort of the uh, the outsider perspective of what I was picking up from watching all those.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I look at that game and I feel like for me, when I encounter most single player games, and I would say even Assassin's Creed falls into this category for me now. If I am not gonna play it immediately, like if I'm not so interested in the game that I'm just gonna sit down and play through it instantly as soon as I get my hands on it, to me there's no value or no need to buy a single player game at full price ever. Um, and I'd put Evil Within into the same category as well, because the simple fact of the matter is, in 3 to 6 months, that game will be half the price it's currently being sold for. And because it's a single player game and I can play it on my own terms and in my own pace, in my own time frame, I would rather just wait and pay less for it and enjoy it whenever I get around to it than have to pay, $50 or $60 for it and then feel compelled like I have to rush through it because I paid so much for it. And then plus that, you get into like these technical issues and details where it's like, oh, this game doesn't have all the options that I want in it yet, or it's crashing, or it's doing this or that. Like, to me, the only real reason to pay full price for a game anymore is to be able to play it with your friends. Um, and I really don't see any justification beyond that for full price games at this point.
Yeah, it takes a lot these days for me to really drop a significant amount of money on a game, and especially since brand new games are, range from $50 to $60. It has to be something very spectacular, or it has to really scratch like nostalgia for me. Like, I always talk about it in in the shape and form of something like another Fallout game. Like, if and when another Fallout game comes out, we'll buy it regardless of reviews, regardless of what I'm seeing. I'm going to buy it because I like that game, I like its lore, and I'm going to buy it day one because it's going to scratch that itch for, not having played a new Fallout game for so long.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, you know, everybody's got that game, right? And for me, for a while there, Assassin's Creed was that game. Like when 3 came out, I pre-ordered it and I pre-ordered the season pass and I just did it because I knew, when that game came out that I was just going to play it, and I was going to be into it and I wanted to commit to that purchase because I was so invested having played 3.5 games from the series so far that I was convinced that that would be worth my money to make that purchase. But especially like on new IPs or games that have maybe uh, run their course to a certain extent, like where they're just kind of retreading the same ground as their predecessors. I feel like that $60 or $50 price point gets harder and harder to justify. And even in like a cooperative game, like this is probably as good a time as any to talk about the new Borderlands game. Like that game to me, I have a really difficult time justifying how that game warrants a $60 price point and a $30 season pass on top of that.
Well, yeah. Again, it just it makes you wonder because again, looking at what the game is essentially and looking at the new features that they have in the game, like there is a few cool things about it. Like don't get me wrong, you're on the moon, so you got the zero gravity thing going for you where you could jump really high and you have to watch your oxygen levels and now there's like laser guns in it and there's like this uh, gun exchange sort of thing that they have where you can grind three weapons into a weapon that's like a rarity class just above it.
Hmm.
So, which I actually kind of like. Actually, I wish that Borderlands 2 had something like that because, of all the loot issues I had with that game. Um,
Hmm.
so just small things like that like is are
Hmm.
cool, but at the same time, you know, getting the new characters that they always put into their games, it's always new characters, um and really just seeing that, oh, they're all kind of recycled versions of previous classes from the game. It kind of makes you kind of go, do I really want or do I really need that, and is it worth, again, more to the point, is it worth $60 plus a $30 season pass? Like me personally, I'll just wait for Borderlands 3, because I really, as much as I like that game, or better yet, I'll just buy it when it's on sale
Hmm.
in a few months. And that's what I'm probably going to end up doing because I like Borderlands, but I'm not. I've given them, more money than I'm happy to admit.
Hmm. Well, I feel like there's something to be said. Oh, that was a nice use of the black ice on the AI's part. Um, oh, that's funny. um, the thing about the Borderlands thing is, you know, I feel like they have fallen into this kind of rut almost, where you know exactly what you're gonna get out of those games, and in some regards that's not a bad thing, but in some regards it is. And I feel like you look at what works about those games is the cooperative aspect, is the basic core gunplay, which of course is largely due to it being based on Unreal Engine, um, and you look at the comedy and the general kind of propulsive nature of the gameplay, that it's just kind of constantly sending you through um, all these different experiences, right? There's always some new thing for you to be uh, experiencing, as part of that gameplay, and all of those things kind of work, but at the same time, like, and again, the comedy that I just mentioned as a strength, I think can also sometimes be a bit of a weakness, because I feel like sometimes that game's comedy is a little like heavy-handed, or it's a little too like it's almost like trying too hard to be funny sometimes, and that can be at least somewhat off-putting at times. And I find myself thinking, is this game gonna be just more of the same that I got out of Borderlands 2? Because to me, Borderlands 2 was that point of diminishing returns where it was just good enough that I enjoyed it, but I have a hard time imagining myself enjoying yet another game done in that same style and with those same tropes and mechanics uh, enough to warrant that price point. And like to me, like the safer kind of better course of action on their part would have been to say, hey, we know this is largely what you've become accustomed to from this series. So rather than trying to hit you over the head for $90 for all of this content, let's be more reasonable about it and say it's, 30 or 40 or $50, for everything. And that I think would have gotten at least a sale from me, and probably more sales from other people who I know who passed on it because of the price and are waiting now for the inevitable Steam sale.
Absolutely. Me, I would easily, if the season pass and the game were both, if it was just $60 for the base game and the season pass, I would buy it. But again, for $60 just for the base game and then $30 for the season pass, I just find grossly overpriced, especially for, again, what kind of experience you're going to get. And on the humor side too, I will say that me playing that second game, for me, the humor was kind of a turnoff, especially going back through and playing the game like through the true Vault Hunter mode.
Hmm.
I just, the humor kind of gets annoying after a while. And
Yeah,
again, but it's a personal preference, but still, I think it's worth
well,
being mentioned.
I think too, there's something to be said for that because one of the big things about the first game for me was how replayable a lot of it was, and how like even though I had been through a lot of that content, more than once, and in a lot of cases like half dozen times in the first game, taking people through those initial scenarios or through different parts of the DLC or whatever, like a lot of that stuff played, even the second or third or fourth time that I saw it, it was still funny or it was still interesting or still like cool. And for some reason, and I can't quite put my finger on exactly what it is about the second Borderlands, but a lot of those jokes, if they worked at all, they only worked once. Where it was like once you'd heard them or once you'd seen the gag or the bit or whatever, it was like seeing it again almost became annoying. And I don't know if that was just general fatigue of the setting or the style of humor, like having been through two games worth of it by then, or what it was. But there's something about the content in Borderlands 2 that felt way more disposable and way less like repeatable than the stuff in the first game did to me.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. Cause me, I liked the first game so much that you know, I liked going back through and playing the content because on top of that, it wasn't the first game's content wasn't so overly specific. Like I almost feel like in some instances in the first game you can almost make your own fun. Whether it's just, going back through and doing like a loot run of a place just to see if anything cool drops, or just doing funny or cool stuff with your friends. It wasn't so overly specific, whereas, the second game it is, but for again the second game it still worked. I'm not gonna say that it didn't work, but um
Yeah, well, it's like I always say about the second game. It's not that I didn't enjoy it or I didn't feel I got my money's worth out of it or whatever, but I felt like it was just enough. Like whereas like the first game was almost like an embarrassment of riches to me, where it was like I got so much out of it and I was so thoroughly entertained by it and all the DLCs and stuff like that. Whereas like the second game, I felt like I just got enough entertainment and enough like pleasure out of playing it that it justified itself. But now like it's made me a little bit gun shy about this pre-sequel because I'm like, well, they're charging this $60 again plus the season pass. Am I really gonna get enough out of that? Is it really gonna be worth it? Um, and I just don't know. Like, and especially now knowing that by the end of this year, at some point, that game is going to be 25 or 30 or even 50% off on a Steam sale before this year is over. I mean, you can pretty much set your watch to that. And the fact that they just did kind of jerky things like not offering a 4 pack, like they did for the first and second game, like I just feel like there's a little bit of a money grub in this new Borderlands game that I just find off-putting, and I think that's part of what's kind of turning me off to it in general.
Well, yeah, yeah, and for me too, the story that they're trying to sling with this game too just isn't interesting enough for me, at least. How it's like the backstory for Handsome Jack, and again, it's a that I know I keep saying it, but it may be a personal thing, but from playing just the first game, I didn't really feel like I needed a backstory on him.
Hmm.
You know what I'm saying? Like, if it was like a almost like a pre thing to like the first Borderlands, like I would have liked that I think a lot more, to
Hmm.
see like how things got to where they were, or almost how like the gun companies got so distinctive from like the first game to the second game, like during
Hmm.
that transition.
Hmm. Yeah. No, I could totally. Well, it's like I always say, like I feel like the characters in the second game are just not as interesting to me as the characters in the first game were. So, it's something that would have been more interesting to me probably would have been to take a look at take a look at how the characters went from being the playable characters that they were in the first game to being the NPCs that they ended up being in the second game. Something like that would have been more interesting to me than introducing all new characters and trying to like shoehorn Handsome Jack into it. I don't know. Yeah, it's weird. It's weird because like Borderlands 2 has this weird dichotomy to it where it sometimes it wants to be so super serious and like almost heavy in the story that it's telling, but then it's just mixed in with all this lunacy and like absurdity that just like I don't know. It's like it's manic depressive or something like that. I don't even know how to describe the narrative in that game. It's just all over the place.
Well, actually, and that's a good point that you bring up, because my big brother, having just finished his first playthrough of Borderlands 2, he makes the point that, not having playing the first one, he didn't really care about any of the characters that were now the NPCs, you know,
Mhm.
the former playable characters that were now the NPCs from the first game.
Mhm.
He didn't really care about, and one of the reasons why he said was because um, the game, he says, just it treads this weird line, and like you just brought up, where it's like it's so, when you have 90%, I think this is what he said. He's like, when you have 90% of your game that is just like memes and, just like humor, or just, 90% humor, and then that 10% that gets like really serious and heavy, he's like, it's just kind of off putting.
Mhm.
And looking back at it now, I kind of tend to agree with that.
Mhm. Yeah, no, there's a weird disconnect in the way that that game is put together that I never really thought that much about it, but thinking more about it as we're sitting here talking about it, it's starting to clarify it a bit to me, like kind of what it was about that second game that I found so like disjointed and nonsensical. Um, but I think like what saved it for me was that the core game was still there and like the gunplay was still enjoyable, the co-op was still enjoyable. But then as we've talked about in the past, there's other things that they kind of screwed up in that game, like the random looting and being able to get decent weapons off of drops and stuff like that. That especially when you go back and play the first game and you realize like how common and exciting and like vital that stuff was to the success of the formula in the first game. It really like is mind blowing how they managed to mess that up so badly in the second one.
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. And it was just, and me, I just still think it was just golden gun thing, or the golden chest in the middle of the city.
Yeah, I mean, they put so much emphasis on the golden chest and getting the keys for it and all that sort of thing that I feel like it became the end all be all of what that game was about. And, what was so fun about the original game is, like you said, just going through an area and finding a chest or, a weapons crate, or like getting a random drop off an enemy and getting some cool weapon, out of that. There was a likely probability that that would occur in that first game that just wasn't there in the second one, and I feel like that was a big design mistake on their part, like removing that possibility.
Well, yeah, yeah. In the second game, it became all about like I did notice that if you got like a uh, a a critical hit, that's what it was. If you got a critical hit on some sort of creature, it seemed like you had an increased chance to get a better drop. But still, for me that's just not enough, especially again from what the first game had already established.
hmm Well, it's again, back to that whole issue of, you know, fun, freewheeling, free spirited, do whatever you want kind of attitude mixed with like crushing specificity. And like in a lot of ways, like that was the how that was reflected in the mechanics. Like that same discord that you saw in the narrative was kind of represented in the mechanics as well. Um, it was almost like you had a camp of people on the development team that were saying, no, this has to be like harder, or this has to be more hardcore. It can't just be fun, or whatever. It's almost like the game had a little bit of an identity crisis, in a way, in that second game that it didn't seem to suffer from in the first one so much.
Yeah, and it could be from the the engine change, like graphically, because the first game's weapons were actually a lot more. I don't know if you'd call them realistic, but I think more grounded in the fact that it could be realistic. I mean, which saying it out loud now, it sounded a lot smarter in my head. But
Nice.
um, I guess from just going from that platform of realism and then taking it to again the more comic book feel that the first game ended up having, may have been a direct cause from the engine change, if that makes any sense.
You mean the art style change?
Art style change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So basically, what you're saying is because the weapons were designed probably mechanically to represent a the real world aesthetic the game was originally going to go with, if they didn't bother to translate that into the cartoony kind of style, that could have explained, you know, why the guns had a better kind of more like visceral, real kind of feel to them.
Yeah, just really a better again, just from handling them, it just felt a lot more responsive firing guns from the first game rather than the second game because that's the weird thing with the second one that you kind of battle is no matter you could get a purple gun, but it could be still like a shit show. Like the gun can actually still be completely useless.
Yeah, just have
So
poor accuracy or poor stopping power or whatever. Some
yeah,
like
or just
critical flawed feature.
yeah, just poor handling, recoil, something that just kind of makes you go, ah, really? Like,
Well, it's like they tried to like expand the variables that the guns could have to such a degree that they just became almost like zany weapons instead of like functional, like fun to use weapons. It was like they were trying so hard to make them outlandish that they ceased to be like cool to have.
yeah, yeah.
Um, Yeah. I mean, and who knows? Maybe that new Borderlands game is awesome. Maybe it's totally fun and exciting and interesting and vital in a way that you know belies what it seems to be. Um, and maybe when I do eventually get around to playing it, I'll look back on it and say, well, maybe that game was worth $60, but there's just this big part of me that thinks that's unlikely to occur just based on the evidence that's available in terms of seeing gameplay footage and people streaming it and all that sort of thing. It just doesn't seem like it's justified based on what I've seen so far. But we shall see.
Yeah, yeah. And speaking of old games transitioning into uh, I guess old games in this case, we could talk about the remastered editions of like Sleeping Dogs and Last of Us.
Oh yeah, yeah. So that's a trend I'd like to see go away. Um, I kind of feel like that's one of those situations where it's like I feel like there almost needs to be a moratorium on releasing a special edition for a game that's less or a complete edition for a game that's like less than 3 years old or something. like like this whole idea of like, oh, we're gonna put out a special edition of a game that came out last year. Wait, what? And I mean, I guess DLC kind of is the root cause of that when you get right down to it. Um, because obviously you have these games that come out, and then over the course of 6 to 12 months after they come out, there's 30% more content released for the game in the form of DLC. And so I guess you could make the argument that that's um, that's what this is all about. But at the same time, I kind of feel like uh, DLC in and of itself probably doesn't justify trying to repackage a game and sell it as new a year after it came out. It's kind of a weird one to me.
Yeah, because in contrast, you have the definitive edition or whatever of Resident Evil 4 that came out for the PC just a few months ago. And like that makes sense, right? Where you got,
Mm-hmm.
a game that is legitimately, old now and it kind of just makes sense for that game to have another um you know or again it makes it more reasonable for that game to have something like that, like an HD edition,
Sure.
um
Well, and I
especially
mean,
on the PC.
and I mean, like the whole idea of a re-release or a remaster would be to like accommodate something like a graphical fidelity jump. Like when you have like Shadow of the Colossus remastered or pick your 10-year-old game remastered. That makes a lot more sense to me than, hey, here's this game that came out last year or the year before and basically looks identical, but now all the DLC's bundled and we're going to tweak the engine a little bit and add a couple colored lights or whatever because we're on new console hardware. Like that the Sleeping Dogs one in particular, I feel like is a really weird one. Um, and I guess part of it is the fact that their DLC strategy was so weird because that game had so much DLC for it. Like there was literally I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say there was like 20 or 30 DLC packs for that game, and a lot of it was just stupid stuff like clothes and cars and things like that. But they were so granular about everything. But then they'd like turn around and sell these bundles on Steam where it was like, get all of the DLC, all 30 DLCs for like $7 or something like that. So you're like I ended up with most of that DLC just because it was so cheap and so easy to come by. Um, and I just think I can't help but think like, man, this is uh, really weird. Like how they're justifying. It's like they're using the new console generation as a means to justify their no as a means to
Their
justify,
profligate behavior.
yeah, as a means to justify, reselling this stuff.
Yeah,
Uh,
and with a console generation that already fails to have backwards compatibility, which in my eyes, again, if you are kind of beholden to just again buying and playing consoles, then that really kind of puts you at a disadvantage when companies come out and do things like that.
well, and they would make the argument that like they're providing a service, right, by letting you play this game on this new console. And I get that there are people for whom a PS4 is their first console or an Xbox One is their first console. And maybe you could make the argument, hey, Sleeping Dogs is a good enough game from last gen that it warrants making that game available on the new hardware, at that, bundle kind of price or whatever. Like I do understand that point of view and I do get the rationale for it. I just like really I'm a little bit worried by the trend because I feel like so much of the video game industry is based on like hype and generating attention for your game that it seems like kind of a bummer to me that these games that came out a year or two ago are getting like that same hype treatment like that they got when they first came out just for releasing on a new platform. Like there are so many games that come out every day that are struggling for attention that when you take that, news feed or news story away from a new game to announce a re-release of a game that's already been, you know, released on multiple other consoles, I think that kind of does a disservice to the gaming community at large and certainly the people who are out there trying to market something totally new. uh, that it almost becomes a distraction in a way. And I kind of, like I say, I kind of have mixed feelings about it because on one level, I understand that there is an audience for those games, but I wonder if it makes sense for them to be, uh, marketed the way they do or presented the way they do within the industry.
Yeah, I mean, if it was just one of those things where it was like, hey, guys, we've got like the Game of the Year edition with better graphics, it'd be like, all right, that makes sense. But again, like you said, when they get like front page, store news and, more attention over, other games that are just trying to out the gate, establish an audience or whatever, it definitely does, it's definitely just not fair. I think it's just what it comes down to. It's not fair to those companies who are just getting started and do not have that sort of, you know, I guess established sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think maybe, it's splitting hairs to a certain extent, and maybe it's not as big of a deal as it would seem to be, but it does make me think this I could see how this could go badly. Like I could see how if this trend really takes off, like are we going to get to a point where, you know, half of the games that come out in 2016 are re-releases of games that came out in 2015? Like that's the thing that I'm worried about, or that's the thing that I don't want to see happen. And so that's why I'm kind of keeping a close eye on what's going on with that stuff and kind of hoping that it's an exception more so than a new rule.
Yeah, yeah. And again, the same goes for because there was also a remastered version of The Last of Us that came out. And again, it's just more of the same, better graphics with the exact same gameplay.
Hmm.
Um, And for me, that one's a little bit more hard to swallow, especially given that that is just kind of purely. I mean, I understand Sleeping Dogs is a single player game as well, but I feel like Sleeping Dogs gives you enough change and enough things to actually do that kind of um, I don't know if it warrants it. Probably not, but I guess more so just
Well, if you didn't buy any of the DLC for Sleeping Dogs, you're certainly getting a lot of content with that that wasn't present in the base game originally. But the other thing
yeah,
about the Last of Us thing that I think actually makes more sense is twofold. One is, obviously with the PS change from PS3 to PS4, you're getting a graphical fidelity bump there. Now, granted, it's not super significant, but it is there. Um, and you're also getting, I think more importantly, another multiplayer game, on a system that doesn't have a ton of multiplayer, content on it at the moment, and I think it's widely acknowledged that Last of Us multiplayer is actually pretty good.
and actually I just forgot about that. I forgot about the extensive multiplayer that they put into that into the definitive edition, like the PS4
Well, yeah.
version of Last of Us.
Yeah, because from what I understand, it's all of the multiplayer that was in the PS3 version, but then again, like they're putting in like the extra maps and DLC and stuff, right, that were separate in the PS3 version.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess it actually, yeah, in that case, it makes more sense to actually buy a version of The Last of Us, a definitive remastered, you know, edition of Last of Us than Sleeping Dogs.
Mm-hmm.
But again, and again, it just comes down to if you haven't gotten any of that DLC content or anything, then with these games, you're going to get that extra content that you didn't have otherwise.
Man, I wish I had a mule.
Mule to the rescue.
So I don't know if you noticed or not earlier on, and I don't even know why I would call this out, but I kind of feel compelled to. I actually screwed up pretty badly like a few turns ago. Like I ended up using a spell that had no impact on the outcome of the battle because it was a strength boost, I think, or like when I was fighting that demon, I tried to use a spell to boost my craft for that attack, but I ended up like not doing anything because I thought the spell was something different than it actually was. So I ended up not only losing the fight, but losing the spell in the process. It was pretty embarrassing.
Yeah, I've been making some mistakes here and there too.
Well, what I'm
It's
finding right as we're doing this is that, and unsurprisingly, it's very difficult to keep track of everything that's going on in the game and talk about this other stuff. Um, which I kind of noticed that in the last game too, but I'm especially noticing it this time for some reason. I feel like maybe the way this game is unfolding is a little more complex than the previous game we played, and so really like to keep track of everything is proving pretty challenging, and to actually try to like comment effectively on these conversational topics on top of that is kind of proving dicey.
yeah, I would. Nah, I mean, I would agree with that. We do have, again, along the lines of games that are just a few months old or whatever, Grid Autosport.
Oh yeah, I definitely did want to talk about that because we talked about Drive Club last week, and I feel like we mentioned Grid in the context of talking about Drive Club, but I feel like Grid kind of deserves a little bit more of a shout out on its own because I really have to say, like, of the games that I've bought this year, I think Grid Autosport may be, it's definitely in my top three, and it may even be my favorite game that I bought this year. Just on the pure assessment of just being a complete, functioning, well done, fun, total package. Like, that game really hits a lot of marks in a way that has become sadly very uncommon for a lot of games. Like I talk often when I talk about games about the fatal flaw or the critical failure in a given game's design or implementation, and how like you can have a game that's like 90 or 95% awesome, but then there's that 5 to 10% of it that just kind of ruins it or like drags it through the mud. And I feel like Grid Autosport's a good example of a game that came out this year where just about everything about that game is great, and there's very little to complain about in that game. I think, based on my time spent with it thus far.
And just the small co-op bits that I've played with you and our other friend. I mean, it's it's fun. I can't, that's really, and it's weird because for being a game that is really kind of rooted in this hardcore aspect, it really does still lend itself to being really fun because it actually awards you to be um, tactical and not just like almost twisted metal it up and just ram everything that moves in
Hmm.
trying to get to the front, because the game actually penalizes you pretty significantly for doing things like that and trying to cut through fields of grass or anything to try and steal the first place mark. And um, it's like it's a real, kind of balls to the wall racing experience, and especially for the PC, that's something to praise, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the just simple things like the fact that when you um, when you hit into somebody in multiplayer, if you have full damage modeling on, you're going to pay a price for that contact. That's going to affect your handling or your car's top speed or something like that. So you really are rewarded for driving cleanly and kind of penalized for not doing so. And I find that that's a very compelling tweak. Like so many online racing games, you have this problem where everybody just piles into the first turn at full speed and bounces off the wall and tries to keep going or jockey for position or whatever, because there's no real consequence to doing that, right? Like everybody just jams into that corner and beats the hell out of each other, and then whoever happens to come out in first usually ends up winning the race. But because of that damage modeling and because of like the more genuine kind of representation of how the cars actually handle, you can't get away with that. You can take a couple of licks, depending on what kind of car you're driving and what speed you're at when you hit into something, but you take more than 2 or 3 hits in a given race, and it's going to have some kind of negative impact on your performance that's going to prevent you from winning.
Oh yeah, yeah.
But like even going beyond that online stuff, which is well, or that like sort of synchronous competitive online stuff, like one of the things that I've been finding that I've been enjoying the most about that game are those weekly RaceNet challenges, where basically you go into the online mode and like even if none of your friends are on, you go in under the RaceNet challenges and it gives you like you know, a given race or a time to beat or some task to accomplish in one of the like 6 racing disciplines that are covered by those. And just doing those every week, and kind of like competing against your friends, for the best score in those, trying to get into the top percentage of people worldwide who are doing those challenges, and um, just otherwise trying to perform as well as you can, because you get money, basically in-game money, for competing in those challenges, and as a result, you end up really enhancing your abilities in the game, basically. And there's just something really compelling about that. I've been doing them now for 3 or 4 weeks because every week it's a new set of challenges, and you basically get like when the new challenges appear, you get the money from how well you did in the last week's challenges, and just that simple kind of mechanic that keeps you coming back every week and doing those, I think has really done a lot to make that game compelling for me in the long term in a way that I didn't expect. There's been a lot of racing games that I've played where I'm really hot and heavy with them for the first month or two, but then like once the flaws in the online implementation are exposed, or once you've unlocked all the cars and tracks and stuff, or once you get to a certain point, you kind of hit that content plateau where you just have seen and done everything there is to do in the game. But with this one, with those challenges, and with how compelling the online gameplay actually is, and how many options they give you to customize and tweak that the way you want it, this game has a longevity to it that I think sets it apart from a lot of other racing games.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, again, if you want like the the Gran Turismo or a Gran Turismo of the PC, I mean, Grid Autosport is basically the closest thing that has come out to really give you that realistic, you know, again, that realistic racing simulator with with all those goodies to boot with like again the challenges, the leaderboards, all
User
that good
entered your
stuff.
channel.
Mm-hmm. Oh, did I forget to move us? I think I did.
Yeah.
User was moved out of your channel. Channel switched.
All right, my mistake. It's all right. I forgot to move us into the private channel before we started. Details. These things happen.
We're all fine here. Everything's fine.
Everything's fine. So one thing I would say too about Grid to just wrap it up is I would not say in my own personal experience that I would compare that game necessarily to a Gran Turismo or a Forza. I don't think it's quite as compelling like mechanically and simulation wise as those games. It's definitely closer to the sim side of things than the arcade racing side of things. I would say that for sure. Um, but I feel like uh, for me anyway, I would still love to see something like a Gran Turismo or a Forza actually come to PC. Like I don't, as much as I love Grid Autosport, I don't think it's a proper full substitute for that sort of game style, but it is quite good. Like it is, it's easily one of the best racing games on PC right now, like without a question. Just in terms of being fun and feature complete and just well put together and compelling for longer than most racing games tend to be.
Yeah, and I think that's fair.
Cool. Well, let's see what else we got here. Okay, so let me delve into like full on geek geekdom here and talk a little bit about Hearthstone because I've been playing an awful lot of that lately. Those of you who watch the stream on a regular basis will no doubt recognize that I probably stream that game more often than any other game when I do stream. And it's just one of those things where I was very reluctant to get into that game when it first came out. Um, and I just have found though that over the past few months playing it, it's got those hooks like a good Blizzard game does. Where you just end up getting sucked into playing more and more of it all the time. And just when you think you're kind of burnt out on it or there's nowhere else to go with it, all of a sudden there's there's that chance, or there's that that next level kind of that you get to with it, I guess is how I would put it. Because, I first started playing that game and I was like, oh, trading card game, whatever. I've done this before. I've played Magic before. I've played, whatever. Pick your trading card game. I've probably dabbled in it at least a little bit over the years. I've even made a trading card game myself, so I kind of am inherently interested in the mechanics of those sorts of games. And I found myself immediately realizing like what it is that Blizzard does that's so compelling is they figure out a way to hook you easily early on in that game, and then there's like that threshold that you'll get to where either you'll kind of become immersed in the mechanics of the game and start thinking about it on a higher level and start thinking about like dissecting your deck building and dissecting like the way you approach playing the game, or you'll kind of hit that wall where you're not willing to make that investment and you end up kind of stepping away from it. And like, much to my chagrin, I managed to get sucked in. Like I got to that point where I did enough with the game that I felt compelled to keep going with it, and now I feel like I'm so far down that rabbit hole, I'm probably just gonna end up playing that game for a good long while.
And from somebody who's been trying to get into it, I can definitely say that that game is decidedly difficult.
There's definitely a wall. There's like a kind of barrier to entry in that game that is very tough to get over. And I think everybody who I've talked to who's played that game has had a similar experience where when you first start playing, and you're doing like practice games against the AI and stuff, you can kind of have at least some limited success early on, and you find yourself like almost getting overconfident in a way about it, and it just becomes like this weird case where if you if you end up getting frustrated and you end up like kind of losing a bunch of battles and you don't feel like you're getting anywhere and you aren't able to adapt your tactics to the way that the game needs to be played, it can I can definitely see how people could get burnt out on it, because the thing that finally made that game click for me was when I started realizing that the way I wanted to play it wasn't necessarily the way that it was designed to be played, and that to really be successful at it, I was going to have to adapt my playstyle to the way that the game naturally flows and progresses. And I still get caught by that sometimes where I feel like, I'm fighting the game sometimes and I'm trying to do things with it that are the things I want to do as opposed to what I like probably should be doing. Um, but that just happens sometimes with a game like that. Uh, it's one of those cases where you're bumping up against the design of the game, I guess, to a certain extent.
Yeah, and you could definitely run into that. I feel a lot of the time, or at least some of the time,
hmm
with a game like that.
I know I've been getting bent. Well, I had been for a while there, getting bent over by arena decks. Trying to build those and have any kind of success with them. I mean, I just had the other night the first arena deck that I've built in a while that actually got 2 wins before I got my 3 losses, and I was just so happy. Like I've yet to get 3 wins on a single arena deck. I thought this was going to be the one that I got to that point with, but even just getting the 2 was so satisfying, because like the 3 decks I had built previous to that, I think I got like no wins on 2 of them and only 1 win on the third, and that was just so disheartening because like you're going and you're saving this gold up, from doing daily quests and stuff, trying to get the ability to build these arena decks, and then you spend the 150 gold doing that, and then you only get 3 shots at playing the deck that you've built before it's gone forever, and you're just like, no. Like I feel like I've reached a point with that game where I almost need to win at least 2 of my arena matches, or I feel like I've wasted my time, doing the deck, or wasted the gold and wasted the time doing it, which is kind of a bad way to feel, or maybe a bad way to approach it. But at the same time, I kind of can't help it. Like, because now I've built several decks that have gotten 2 wins. I've gotten to a point where I almost expect that, and if it doesn't happen, it's just kind of like a bummer.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's a serious investment of time, and that's why it probably feels so disheartening when you don't, uh, actually win an arena match. Because it takes the gold. It takes first doing the dailies to get the gold to actually do the arena matches. And so, if you don't get lucky enough to get a good selection of cards, and then if you don't get lucky enough to draw, the right cards during the match, then it could definitely become frustrating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no doubt. Man, I guess we're going to drop this. I wish I had a mule.
A mule.
But yeah, as far as the Hearthstone stuff goes, I mean, I'm definitely still really enjoying my time with the game, and I'd say it's pretty obvious at this point that they've made a good game. I definitely still have some concerns about balance issues in that game. Like, I've been talking a lot lately about on other streams about how I feel like the Warlock class in particular is a bit overpowered because its hero ability is so strong. Like that ability to just draw a card whenever you want for the cost of 2 health. Um, I feel like almost seems just just crazy that you can do that because the utility of that is just so high. And I feel all kind of similarly about the priest class's ability to heal for 2, off the hero power as well. Like I feel like those 2 classes to me kind of stand apart from the other 6 in terms of just their hero powers having so much functionality and utility that I almost feel like the other classes just can't compete with them in the arena, except for with the possible exception of the mage, because I feel like the mage's hero power is similarly utilitarian. Um, but at the same time, I've now had the chance to play a warlock in the arena, and even though I did get my 2 wins pretty easily, and I feel like the 2 out of the 3 matches where I lost were very close and could have gone either way, I didn't feel as overpowered as I thought I was going to, and the wins didn't come as easily to me as I thought they would. So I'm kind of having to back off on that assessment a little bit. Uh, when I first started playing the Warlock, I really felt like maybe it was just ridiculously overpowered versus everything else. And while I still think it's kind of skewed in that direction a bit, it's maybe not as unbalanced as it initially seemed to be to me.
I mean, I think that's fair to say.
I think part of the problem for me with the Warlock is when I first started playing it, I basically got like 5 wins in a row with it, and they were all pretty decisive wins, and that gave me maybe like a false sense of its potency. But then, like, I got to that inevitable point where I started losing matches. Uh, but then, like, even the matches that I lost seemed um, close. So I never, like, as much as I've been playing the Warlock, I've never really felt as though I was outclassed. Like most of the matches where I've lost as Warlock, I felt like it was at least close, or it could have gone either way. I think I've only really been blown out of like the 20 or so matches that I've played with that class, maybe like once or twice. And every other time I've either won or it's been within a turn of winning before I got taken out.
Yeah, yeah.
But I mean, Hearthstone in general, I think is a pretty interesting game, and especially now that I've gotten past that point of uh, learning like the basics of the game and building custom decks for all the different classes and really getting a handle on most of the cards and what they do. I definitely feel like I'm at least reasonably invested in it at this point, and it's just a question of how long will it be before I get bored with the content that's available? How long will it be before they introduce new cards or new modes or functions to the game? I know there was just an announcement a couple weeks ago that I guess they're going to do their first card expansion pack, which is going to have like 100+ cards in it. So I'm thinking that should shake things up pretty interestingly. And from what I understand, they're going to be releasing that in phases. So like it won't be like there's 100 new cards overnight that you have to learn. It'll be like, maybe they'll introduce like 10 or 20 or 25 at a time through various in-game mechanics and kind of trickle them out so that people have time to acclimate to them and work them into their deck builds and such.
I think that would definitely be a better way to kind of handle that.
Yeah, I think well, it's smart in two ways, right? Because on the one hand, they get to stretch out that content further and get people give people more content on a more consistent basis. So instead of like going, hey, oh hey, here's 100 cards, learn them over the course of the next couple of days, and then complain about how there's no new content. They can give you 10 or 20 cards, a couple of times over the course of 6 or 8 or 12 months, and then you're getting this constant feed of new content to fiddle with. Um, so I think that makes a lot of sense.
You got to find. I mean, that's the thing too with that is like you have to find a way to make it interesting. So,
Hmm.
or I guess to in this case keep it interesting.
Yep.
And that's definitely a way to do it.
I think the big thing that I would like to see added into that game, though, and the thing that would really get its hooks into me um, completely, is if they were to figure out some way to have some sort of cooperative element to it. Like if you could somehow like go on a raid co-op with your friend using those card mechanics, I think that would be amazing.
Well, and I think you could definitely do something like that in that game. I mean, they already kind of allude to that in the tutorial. I think just playing through the tutorial and facing some of those opponents in like
Hmm.
the or well, I guess it's technically the story or whatever, but it's kind of the campaign as well. But
Hmm.
again, I think it still lends itself to that to a possibility of that being the case.
Hmm.
And you can almost have a thing too where it's like you have to share the mana pool with everybody. So you really have to kind of like talk it out and figure out what you're going to do instead of just being like everybody gets a turn. It's almost like, you get maybe 5 or 6 mana to start your turn, and you kind of have to figure out what everybody wants or needs to do in the early stages or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Well, it's like, I always say everything's better with co-op. That I really do kind of believe that to an extent, especially, given the way that I tend to play games in recent years. Like, I just like the ability or the option to share that experience and to have the things that I'm working towards or building towards, just like it's just cool to be able to like have other people see your deck, in action and not have to like face its wrath, but actually, like say, oh, I've got all these cool cards that I've gotten, from playing the game. Let me, help you do this quest or whatever. Or let's team up and fight this big or something like that. Like there's that social aspect to any game that's based on around the idea of acquiring things where you want to show off what you've acquired. And you might appreciate somebody else's deck when you come up against it in an adversarial way, but it's not in the same way that you'd appreciate coming against it or seeing it in a cooperative way. It's a lot easier to like be complimentary of and appreciative of what somebody else has done in the game when you're working with them towards a common goal.
Yeah, yeah, and that's really just the beauty of co-op. And as we even mentioned the game too before, Borderlands, that was always something that I liked to do in Borderlands, was show off like cool guns that I got to my friends. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh yeah, I mean, I can definitely have distinct memories of and recollections of, you know, uh, uh, getting a new gun and being super amped to show it to people, just to say like, oh, check out this thing I found, especially in the first game. Oh my goodness, some of those guns were so crazy.
oh god, the rocket launching shotguns and
Hmm.
all kinds of crazy stuff there.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, like I say, I think if there were one thing I'd really like to see them do in Hearthstone, it would be a cooperative mode. And yeah, if they could figure out some way to make that happen and pull that off in a compelling fashion, I think that would be awesome. Get on that, Blizzard.
Make it so.
Nice. So I've noticed that things are getting a little bit serious here. It seems as though we might be approaching the end of this game.
Yeah, safe
So
to say.
I was thinking maybe, given that we should probably maybe not start a new topic and just kind of play this game out and concentrate on what we're doing a little bit.
That makes sense to me.
Cool. Yeah, let's do that. Because I feel like this is about to get dramatic.
Yeah.
Ooh, feeding the vampires. Very nice.
Vampire food has been served.
Nom noms. I bet that
Nom.
horse was very delicious for them. I bet they really enjoyed that.
They wanted to go on a horse and buggy ride. They just did it in the wrong place.
Yeah, I'm thinking if you're the guy who, arranges the route for the horse and buggy ride, you probably don't want to take it through vampire territory. I'm thinking that doesn't end well.
You'd probably lose your job after one or two runs doing something like that.
Yeah, yeah, you'd not have a future in that profession, I don't think.
Yeah, nah, nah. That would not end well.
I'm kind of looking at the AIs and realizing that the warlock potentially could do something here, but I'm doubtful that that will actually happen.
Yeah, unfortunately, I still don't think that the AI is quite there yet.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely could use a another go around of polish, and that's something I would like to see from whatever the next patch ends up being. When the expansion comes out, I definitely would like to see um, some more emphasis put on the AI behaviors and making them a little more competitive in these scenarios.
It would be nice, wouldn't it?
Indeed.
What I do, just vaporize them or something?
Yeah, I think you auto kill them with that much strength, I would say. I was actually kind of surprised that you took the craft path with that much strength.
I had the gnome,
Ah, okay. Yeah, I forgot about that.
and then I fed him to the vampires.
Yeah, yeah, that was. You have served your purpose, gnome.
Yeah, now be gone!
Be gone, I say unto thee.
Poor gnome.
Oh my god, game. Well, I guess this isn't the worst thing ever. Stuff's about to get scary. Oh, he's going in. He's going for it.
I'm not convinced of that. He might just jump right back out because he didn't like his choices of movement.
That's possible. That would be kind of cool if he went for it, though, because he definitely should.
Oh, I think it'd make it a lot more interesting if he. I mean, I hope he does, but got a nagging feeling that he's not going to.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't be surprised if you were correct, and then he just jumps back out, but I'm curious to see what happens here for sure.
Trade for strength.
Yeah, that other AI didn't fare too well, did he?
Nope. Poor AI.
hmm Get me away from death.
Away with you.
So what's happening there? You better kill me. No! Not cool.
Oh!
You're lucky. You're so lucky that I didn't roll a 3 or higher.
I think I like Dance Macabre.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Pretty cool ending. All right, now you better win. Win, because if the AI wins, then we can't do the show anymore.
There's no way that these AI are coming for me. They've just given up, I think. Or they do that really annoying thing that AI do when they're just kind of like, oh, let's just keep going around in circles forever and not, oh,
Oh,